The presenter of our main talk this week is part of the Oasis gang. I forgot to print up his bio, which he nicely sent me, so I'm going to make it up. He's a really nice guy. He teaches high school. He's extremely sharp, and he's spoken to us before. He did a talk on teaching evolution in Texas schools, which was an amazing talk. So I know this one's going to be awesome too. Welcome. He doesn't really need an introduction, as we all know him. Sam Whittenton.
I'm up here today to talk to you a little bit about something that's important. Something that's important to me, to you, to everybody. I want to talk about misinformation. The false or inaccurate information, especially that which is deliberately intended to deceive. But it can take the form of mistaken ideas that are being shared, misunderstood facts, or just pure fiction. The reason for the spread of misinformation can be varied. Profits, political influence, pranks, but the consequences can be serious, even deadly. The anti-vaccination movement, that's the group of people asserting beyond all evidence to the contrary that vaccines are dangerous and cause problems like autism and lethargy, has a death toll of about 9,020 from 2007 to 2015. And that's not just counting the number of preventable diseases that it's caused. And down here, this big red zero, that's the number of autism cases that are actually linked to vaccines. So close to 15,000 diseases, 9,020 deaths, 0 autism cases. Holistic and other bunk medical claims cost consumers billions of years and endanger lives. And because of the political and corporate pressure to deny human-caused climate change for so many years, the world is currently in a global warming crisis. More frequent wildfires, longer periods of drought in some regions, disappearing ice caps, rising sea levels, mass extinctions, increase in the number, duration, and intensity of tropical storms, all the consequence of long-term spread of misinformation about human-caused climate change. Or I found this out when my wife Laura was doing her research for her talk on women's reproductive rights, that if you try to search fetal development, you're very likely going to see some very skewed images of fetuses with faces and fingers at stages where they actually just don't have them, and at scales that are misleading to their actual size. Not to mention the flagrant and fraudulent videos that the anti-choice group, the Center for Medical Progress, there's some misinformation in their name right there, produced to slander Planned Parenthood. The backlash of that has been costing women their right to health care, STI screenings, and other very important social necessities. Right down to the basic tenets of how science works. The threat of teaching creationism in schools is still an issue because of the spread of a fundamental lie that creationism, intelligent design, or whatever they want to call it next is science, when it's not. It's the opposite of science. It's disguised as science with half-truths and sciencey-sounding words, but it's not science. So the dangers are real, but I'm not up here to give a pseudo-sermon railing against the anti-science agenda. I mean, I could, but I would rather take a few minutes to talk to you about some mental tools that you might find helpful in just sort of cutting through the seemingly endless sea of vacuous crap we're marred with daily. But first, I just want to make sure that you know I'm not a scientist. I've taught science for about 8 years. I have a science degree in psychology. I mean, that helps. But I'm not a scientist. I'm not a particular expert in any specific field. What I want to share with you are some things that I, as a layperson, have found helpful to defend against being sold on a bad idea. I do know that we actually have some science professionals and people with strong science backgrounds in the Oasis community. So if I get anything wrong, or if you think there's a better way to clarify a concept, feel free to share during the Q&A or on the Facebook group later or whenever. All right, a skeptical mindset is your best defense against misinformation. Skepticism has served me well. It hasn't won me too many friends, but it was an early stepping stone for me to becoming a free thinker and hopefully a more well-informed individual. And in part, it brought me here, so I guess it has gotten me some friends. Skepticism is not, as many would portray it, a negative stance. It most certainly doesn't mean that I think every claim is wrong until it's proven beyond the shadow of a doubt. It's a little bit more subtle. Good skepticism actually comes from a point of neutrality, just staying neutral until all the facts are considered. It's a line of reasoning based on verifiability. that demands a certain amount of evidence to concede whether or not a specific claim is likely to be true. A good example of skeptical thinking, which also happens to be why I got into skepticism in the first place, because I just thought that this was so important, it involves the anti-vaccination movement. I was working in a school for children with autism and other learning differences at the time when I first heard the theory that vaccines cause autism. And my first reaction was an incredulous, like, whoa, really? I mean, what a scandal, right? All the time, the millions of people that have been vaccinated, and then it sort of started to dawn on me, well, what about the millions of people? What exactly was the risk factor, if any? If mercury in the shots caused autism, then why didn't we see autism with other kinds of mercury poisoning? And the questions just kept on coming, and they got more specific to that claim. So I hit the web, as we used to say in the early 2000s. I would later read about how the discredited doctor who first made the claims falsified his findings and was planning to release his own version of vaccines after the panic he created caused a demand. Or how the journal that published the fraudulent study retracted its publication, or how the medical community was up in arms, warning of the dire consequences of parents not vaccinating their children, some of which have actually come to pass because of that persistent lie. I'm still keeping track of it. All the studies that have been done, and we're talking about literal dozens of good studies, well-designed, showing no link whatsoever to autism and life-saving vaccines. But the point is that I didn't need to be a medical doctor to figure all that out. I didn't have to be a microbiologist or a neurologist. All it took was the right line of questioning and the criteria for what a credible source was. For an example of what skepticism is not, look at the way some people claim skepticism for the Earth being a sphere. There are direct observations, there's direct evidence to the contrary to flat Earth theory. There's the rest of the planets, which you can see are not flat. There's all the problems with gravity in the moon, as you can imagine. Plus, there are actual photographs and hundreds at this point of people who've been in space, and a dozen or so who've walked on the moon. So anyone who would assert that if the Earth is anything but a spheroid would be not qualified as skepticism. Ignoring verifiable facts and using faulty logic is the opposite of skepticism. You can talk to me later over drinks about what I really think about the flat Earth people.
We already know.
Skepticism can go beyond scientific claims, though. There are social and political stories that turn out to be false as well. I personally find these to be equally as offensive to debunked science claims because they just spread ignorance and they're strengthened by the fabrications. A point to which there is some blame to be cast on sensationalistic journalists and proponents of what we would call clickbait. But I only have a short time with you, so I'm going to focus on scientific claims rather than trying to defend against every bogus story spat out at us from BuzzFeed or whoever. But you'll see, though, that some of these strategies I'm going to talk about can apply to other fields as well. So here are some ways to navigate the onslaught of information that we receive on a regular basis that claim to be scientific, in hopes that we do not allow ourselves to assimilate any incorrect, possibly damaging views in our own world perspective, while allowing us to remain open-minded to the good information. So let's talk about that line of reasoning. Most of us get access to scientific information through science journalism, but I hate to tell you that's kind of a shambles right now. Science journalism, it's just a minefield of bad information. Journalists who are more concerned with a scoop or a sensational story are often misleading or misinterpreting scientific studies. Or at the very least, they're not being critical enough of poorly designed studies. Your first line of defense against that kind of fakery of misinformation are just a few questions. One, is the intended purpose of the story to make you feel a certain way? If yes, what's their agenda? Why are they trying to do that to you? If an article or story makes you feel strongly about something, you owe it to yourself to verify if it's true. For the record, though, good scientific studies don't have an emotional agenda for the audience. They just don't. So if you're enraged or validated by a scientific claim, you're more likely to believe it, and that's just a red flag. What's the source of the story or claim? If you look for it in multiple places, could you find it? Can the facts be verified through other sources? The key is reputable there. If you're looking at Earth Mother, holisticmedicine.com, and hippydippy.org agrees with them. Those two are kind of in cahoots in that respect. So reputable is really the key there. A good example would be reporting that abortion causes lasting psychological harm to women. If its only link is the Center for Medical Progress, then that claim is likely invalid because it can't be verified by a not so blatantly biased source. So what's the bottom line? What's the claim? Can that be verified with reliable facts? Again, the key is reliable. When Dr. Crackpot from Never Heard of It University claims that 9/11 was an inside job because jet fuel can't melt steel beams, who else in the scientific community can verify the facts of his claim? Are there scientists who disagree with it, and why? Can they be verified? Again, the key, verifiability. How does this impact other established facts, and could they be wrong? If this one study turns all of physics on its ear, and what we know of up and down can't be true, if this is true, then either the entirety of all of physics is wrong, or maybe there was just a problem with this one study. And bad science loves reporting anomalies and correlations. For those of you who don't know, an anomaly is when some random 1 in a million circumstance causes a skewed result in scientific data. This is a comic strip from Saturday Morning Breakfast cereal. It says, after 19 additional trials, of course, the results were shown to be anomalous. And the punchline is, the tortoise and the hare is actually a fable about small sample sizes. Or if you take a look at the WOW signal, which is the name given to the strong narrowband radio signal detected by Jerry Ehrman back in 1977. He was working at the SETI Big Ear Radio Telescope project in the Ohio State University. Basically, there was this brief blip of anomalous signal that was unlike anything else that they found in the background noise of space. He wrote WOW next to it, hence the name WOW signal. And there's still a lot of conjecture about what that could have been. Many claims, from proof of alien life to the unraveling of our understanding of the nature of physics and the age of the universe, all born out of this little blip of data, which in all likelihood probably has a more mundane explanation, but it's never going to really know. But correlations are another strong tool of the sensationalist and the intellectually dishonest. People love to see two charts in it. There are more. But correlation does not equal causation. You can say that to yourself every time you see a headline that uses the word linked or associated with. Just like right here, we got the number of films Nicolas Cage starred in correlates very well with the number of people who drowned in swimming pools last year, or in 1999 to 2009. Or the U.S. spending on science and technology is directly correlated with suicide by hanging and strangulation or suffocation. And this one's my favorite. People who died falling out of wheelchairs correlates almost perfectly with the cost of potato chips. So, make it a mantra, correlation does not equal causation. Does the claim link to a scientific study? And what is the nature of that study? If there's a link to a scientific study in an article, read that paper. Click the link, go to the study, read the study. Oftentimes, science journalists latch onto a flimsy premise or conjecture and pass it along with the quotes, "scientists have found," which is misleading. And as I'm about to explain, not all scientific studies are created equal. A good example of this would be that recent scientific claim that religious children are less altruistic than non-religious children. On the surface, it seemed really valid. There were about 1,000 kids studied across a number of countries. They showed statistically significant numbers of children were less generous if their families were religious. Except, there are these things called controls in science. Controls help you control for certain other factors that might influence your results. Like, let's say, if you were studying how generous children were with resources without factoring in whether or not those children come from impoverished families where resources are scarce, for example, this study didn't do that. So all this stuff about religious kids are more selfish, religious kids are meaner, etc., All that without the fairly obvious consideration that the likelihood of being poor correlates with coming from a religious family, and that might influence whether or not you're willing to share stickers or whatever they were measuring in the experiment. There are also other confounding variables in that study too, including culture, the children's level of trust with the adults they were interacting with, and the general environment that the children lived in. So I'm sorry, we're just going to have to stick with a multitude of other legitimate reasons that religion is not so good for human life. But for now, there's no sufficient, though there doesn't seem to be any sufficient evidence for it making people more selfish from the get-go. In determining whether or not a study is worthwhile, there are a few considerations you can make. This is where things get a little bit difficult for the layperson who doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about p-values or standard deviations, so I'm going to try and keep this as jargon-free as possible. Full disclosure, because I'm not good at explaining certain things in an organized way, I'm borrowing heavily from a 2013 article by Jennifer Raff from a website called Violent Metaphors. If your interest is piqued by my clumsy descriptions and vagaries of this, I strongly urge you to go and read her article series, which goes into a lot more detail and offers a lot more direct knowledge. Anyhow, if you're going to briefly analyze the scientific study, find out who published it. Was that a peer-reviewed journal? If it's not peer-reviewed, then it's practically not worth reading. It might have a good opinion in it, but peer-reviewed, not. If you don't know, check online for its reputation. Reputable journals are listed in academic indexes and are referenced by other papers. Look at other articles published in that journal. If any of them seem less than legitimate, that alone doesn't invalidate the study, but not all journals have the same rigorous standards for publication, so take it for what it's worth. Take a look at the authors. What are their affiliations? Google them. Find out what institutions they're associated with. Some institutions are well respected. The University of Texas, the University of Houston, and I guess also Cambridge, Columbia, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, MIT, Princeton, Stanford are good too, but you get the idea. Others, like the Discovery Institute, the Family Research Council, and Center for American Values, they have legitimate sounding names, but they're very agenda-driven. Step 3, read the study summary and determine why it was done at all. What's the big problem in science-wise that it's trying to solve? In my opinion, it's a red flag if a scientific study can't point directly to an area in its field that it's specifically trying to shed light on. Looking back at the study about kids from religious backgrounds being less philanthropic, what big questions in science is that objectively trying to answer? Like, what was the point? The whole thing just seemed a little fishy from the headline. Step 4, what are the scientific questions the study is trying to answer, and what was their approach? These two things should come together to make sense. You may have to Google a few words, since science has a varied vocabulary with its own specific meanings, but if you can't draw a logical conclusion from the methods to the questions being answered, or at least have it explained in a comprehensive way, then there's likely a problem with that study. Also, just check to see if their methods were sound. Check the sample size. Does the number of participants or subjects taken justify the implications for the question? For example, if a study claiming that a sample size of about 30 college students is representative of a population of 300 million, that's a bogus claim. Check for confounding variables that may invalidate the study. Randomizing groups, utilizing strict controls, and clearly defining variables into measurable factors all contribute to eliminating potential third variables that can influence results. Look specifically for how certain biases were controlled for. Some bias is inevitable. The researchers should show that they understand that, though, that they've tried their best to lessen the impact or to account for it in the statistics and analysis phase. Research bias, also called experimenter bias, is a process where science or scientists actually influence the results. Sampling bias occurs when the process of sampling actually introduces an inherent bias in the study by disproportionate inclusion or exclusion. Procedural bias is where an aspect of the procedure influences the result. Think of like a high-pressure situation where maybe they're giving an IQ test and they have a ticking clock in the room that can skew your results. Measurement bias arises from simply an error in the data collecting or process of measuring, because math is hard. Interviewer bias is one where the interviewer might unconsciously influence the subject, or conversely, There's response bias, where the subject might unconsciously wanting to be giving the answers that the interviewer wants to hear. Reporting bias is just an error where the dissemination in the literature becomes skewed because positive results are more likely to get publicized than null results. You don't read about the countless studies where, yes, everything turns out it's exactly the way we thought it was. I mean, it's just one of those things. And that's actually gotten pretty bad with the internet because, information's out there and it's getting spread pretty rapidly without a lot of consideration for, a multitude of other factors. All right, step 5, check the results. Take a good hard look at any charts and graphs they might use. If the word significant starts getting thrown around, check what is meant exactly by the term significant. A lot of times, what a scientist would consider significant results are not necessarily logistically significant, but more mathematically significant. In doing research for this, I read a lot of interesting articles about scientific significance and the math that they use. And sometimes fuzzy math can point to false significance. But check to make sure that any claims by their results can hold water. And those charts, if you have a look, this was one, I keep on picking on reproductive rights today, but charts can lie. This was a representative, and this was the actual chart that they used. You notice how the y-axis on the legitimate chart is labeled and the one on the not legitimate chart isn't? That is so that they could show a much more drastic slope on either side, showing cancer screening and preventive services at Planned Parenthood are going way down, and abortions are just skyrocketing. It really turns out that cancer and preventive services actually went down a little bit, and abortions negligibly, just a blip higher. So without reference, things can be very misleading. Check the claims made in the discussion section of the study. After reading the methods and results, do you agree with the claims made by the authors, or in many cases the journalists who like to put words in the mouth of the authors of a study? Don't take for granted the notion that a journalist or even a scientist can make a broad claim about a complex system like society or human behavior, body systems, microbiology, chemistry, that can only be linked to one study. And finally, what do other respected figures in that field have to say about that study? Hit Google, just search it. Google Scholar is really great too. Search what the arguments against the findings of the study are. They might not be good arguments, but just see if anybody out there has published a worthwhile gripe about the conclusions of the study that you might have missed. Determine what the scientific consensus is, if any. That is to say, what do most scientists who are experts on this field say about the topic? Something that I cannot emphasize enough. Consensus is more than just popular opinion. It's the culmination of evidence to provide a general idea of agreement on a topic. It's very difficult to build consensus inside a single discipline, like the 97% consensus that climate change is real and caused by people, or even between disciplines, like the agreement between genetics and physical anthropology. Let me borrow again from a better writer. I'm going to paraphrase a 2014 article by a guy named John Timmer on this topic of scientific consensus. So let's say that there's some odd cosmic observation. Those results are going to be considered in terms of the existence of dark matter particles, given that there's a consensus that those particles exist. It doesn't matter whether the researchers or the sum of their results agree with that consensus. The existence of a consensus shapes the discussion, in the same way that research goals and grants are set based on the areas where the consensus opinion seems a bit weak or has unanswered questions. The fact that a single study, disagrees with a consensus or not, does not destroy the consensus, nor does it disprove it. There was a mountain of evidence needed to build the level of agreement, and the fact that a single study disagrees rarely does much to shake that mountain of data. In fact, one popular strategy of those who stand to gain from a misinformed public is to emphasize the false notion that there is a debate. Climate change denialists, evolution denialists, anti-vaxxers, and the tobacco industry have all used this method. The idea that if you confuse the public, that there's a great internal debate among researchers about a topic, then the social impetus to make that needed change has a much harder time moving forward. There's a word for the study of culturally induced ignorance. It's called agnotology. It is, once you're aware of it, one of the most maddening things to see on a news program or a panel discussion show, where you see someone like Bill Nye or Neil deGrasse Tyson presenting what is the vast majority of scientists' belief based on the evidence that they have at the time, and either a crackpot or a mouthpiece for a powerful group presenting a contrasting opinion as if they were equally valid when they're not. It's just a frustrating thing to see. One final piece of advice. Prepare to be wrong. It happens a lot. This isn't foolproof, and the fact that there is so much just bad information out there, being wrong happens. And that's the whole point. Being ready to accept that your assertions might be based on faulty information. It's what the whole thing's about. So be ready to change your mind based on good evidence. And if at all possible, find a person who you disagree with and can still have a respectful exchange. Oftentimes, some of the most crystallizing arguments for or against something being true have come from a healthy discussion with the person who disagrees. But that's from my own personal experience, which any good scientist will tell you is really no evidence at all. So take it for what it's worth. How to make a scientist's head explode. The scientist is saying anecdotal evidence isn't valid, and the non-scientist is saying, yes it is. I once used an anecdote as evidence, and later it turned out I was right. So thank you. If you have any questions.
Just back to what you were saying at the very beginning about you're not a scientist, I would like to disagree with that. Because as long as you're using critical thinking and you base your conclusions on evidence, you may not make a living as a researcher, but you are definitely a scientist.
Like a citizen scientist.
Good. Noe. And then Marina? Okay.
I think one of the problems is that even the celebrity scientists, the established celebrity scientists go on television whenever there's a new discovery and say, this throws everything we studied over the last 20 years out. And we have to start out, well, if they do that, then what did they bother to go to college for? Just
Sensationalism, yeah.
I don't really have a question, but I think one of the most important things when you talk about science is to realize that there is the scientific opinion at this point. Science in general moves back and forth, people looking at the issue from different perspectives, and we just have to be okay with a little bit of uncertainty. So rather than saying, I am sure this is how it happens, well, yes, I think in terms of relativity or gravity or something, the science has moved there that we've pretty much established it. But in a lot of the modern things, like Alzheimer's disease, that's one of my biggest areas, there's so much evidence on a variety of different sides. There's not one study that's really going to say this is the one mechanism that leads to Alzheimer's disease. There's uncertainty in science, and I think we just have to be okay with it and say, well, to my knowledge, rather than say, ooh, I am the know-it-all in this particular field.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Being okay with a certain amount of uncertainty is just a part of being a well-informed consumer of information. Just being okay with that. We might not know. That's absolutely right. Thank you.
I think on certain topics, some of us might dig into some of the studies, but one of the reasons I think the journalism is so appealing is it has a way of condensing some of the information in areas maybe like Alzheimer's, which I would normally not look into. Do you have any recommendations for journalistic resources that do seem to really respect the scientific method and are good resources for looking at studies?
That is a tough one because I've seen good reporting and bad reporting from pretty much every media source that I've seen. I really look at it a case-by-case basis, which is why always go and check what study they're citing, because even good journalists sometimes make mistakes and are not rigorous enough in their research. Mostly because they have a different agenda than just disseminating the truth. They have to lure you in. So whenever you see something like that, yeah, just even if it is from a source that you would find generally reputable, still go through and check just to make sure, because I've seen it happen on good websites and bad websites alike. Oh, okay.
Oh, we got you next.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the internet. You have to be very careful about that now. On the one hand, they come out with things like there's that science piece at the bottom of the Google News. They have a propensity for coming out with things that are very preliminary. They've only done one study, they only had a handful of people. But on the other hand, the internet has helped speeding up things, speeding up the science, because before it would take you years to get things printed up and through the peer-reviewed journalism and everything. But now,
Yeah, it's definitely a
in a way,
double-edged
it's a good
sword.
thing.
Yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword in that it can help distribute really good information very quickly, but at the same time, there is a danger to that where a bad idea might just get a lot more footing than it deserves. It's a very good point.
Thank you, Sam, for your talk. I just want to see if you would agree that any publication that routinely retracts their mistakes, such as you mentioned the Lancet and the vaccination article, that would be a good sign of a reliable source.
I would say that any source that will go on record as saying that we did make a mistake or that this turned out not to be true, and will make that well known. Not just like a little footnote at the end, but make it their front page, like, hey, we goofed up. I think that is a good sign that you're reading a reputable source just on that premise alone, that they would actually admit a mistake. So I give them a little bit more benefit of the doubt for that.
Great. Let's give Sam a big. Thank you.